And with that, I will hand things over to Tanya. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm having technical difficulties. Just a minute.
John, would you mind advancing to the next slide?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
While we're waiting for Tanya, I'll go ahead and read the land acknowledgement. It is with gratitude and humility that we acknowledge that we are learning, speaking, and gathering on the ancestral homelands of the Mohican people, who are the indigenous peoples of this land. Despite tremendous hardship in being forced from here, today their community resides in Wisconsin and is known as the Stockbridge-Muncie community. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors, past and present, as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all.
Thank you, Dan, and my apologies. I'm back. Hello, everyone. I am Tanya Isa, and thanks for spending part of your evening with us this evening. I would like to introduce our speaker tonight, Professor Emeritus John Delano. John holds a PhD in geochemistry. He taught and researched at the University at Albany until 2016, when he retired as distinguished professor to Williamsburg, Virginia, where he lives now. During his academic career, he served as the Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the university, as Associate Director of a NASA Astrobiology Institute involving a consortium of 5 universities. He was the recipient of several university awards, including the President's Award for Exemplary Public Engagement. He served on more than 24 scientific advisory panels for both NASA and the National Science Foundation. His research was funded principally by NASA and resulted in 70 peer-reviewed articles in professional journals. John has enjoyed a very active retirement in which he's continued to publish, teach at the College of William and Mary, give presentations, and volunteer doing lots of different things, including trail maintenance. He's a member of the James City County Rotary Club and the Capitol Club of Williamsburg. He's a volunteer interpreter in the archaeology department at Colonial Williamsburg, and he's a volunteer mentor for Colonial CASA. We are so lucky to have John share his knowledge and fascination with stone walls in Rensselaer Manor with us this evening. While he was living here in this area, John measured more than 150 miles of stone walls within Rensselaer Manor by walking in the woods with a GPS unit and by LiDAR imaging. LiDAR stands for light detection and ranging. These stone walls are products of enormous efforts made by subsistence farmers in the 17th to 19th centuries prior to the widespread abandonment of homesteads in the late 19th century. With these data and historic documents, the stories of some of these intrepid families have been revealed. A quick reminder before I hand off to John to please put your questions in the chat and to remain on mute. Midway through John's presentation, we will pause and I will be asking him the questions from the chat and he'll have an opportunity to answer. So John, we're thrilled to have you. Please take it away.
Thanks very much, Tanya. It's really a pleasure to be invited to speak at the Rensselaer Plateau Alliance Speaker Series. It's really great to see you all, and I hope that you will enjoy this talk about stone walls, which are very near and dear to my heart and probably to yours as well. As we look at old abandoned stone walls in the woods, I'd ask a couple of questions. What are we seeing when we look at them? What is their historical context? And if those walls could talk, what stories would they tell us? And I hope by the end of this talk, you'll get at least a glint that they have really an exciting story, a really heartwarming story in many instances to tell about the families who built them. The sources of the information that I've used, and I'll touch on aspects of most of these, are books and peer-reviewed articles on stone walls in the regional history. And I have 3 books listed there. And at the end of this talk, I will have 3 slides loaded up with these specific, with probably about 50 sources that you will be able to see and to pick from if you're interested. Federal census data, land surveys from the New York State Archives. And I'll return to those because I have photographed well over 100 of them and archived them in the Brunswick Historical Society near to you, right off Route 2. Township maps, photographs from the Rensselaer County Historical Society, deeds from the clerk's office, Google Earth and LiDAR images, Ancestry.com, barbed wire, and many hours of exploring the woods in which I donated a lot of blood to mosquitoes, measuring these stone walls that we'll talk about. The outline of the talk is shown here. Part 1, first half will be an introduction, the rocky soils of New York and New England, clearing the land of trees and rocks, and the nature of walls, fences, and wires. And after we get to those, after we've gone through those 4 points, we'll stop, as Dan mentioned, for some questions at that point. And then we'll finish off with some of the data that I have collected wandering in the woods to measure stone walls, LiDAR imaging of stone walls, a specific example of a family in Grafton Lake State Park, and a summary. So let's get started with an introduction. First, I'm a country kid. This was when I was a little kid, 5, 6 years old. We lived on this road, which at the time was a dirt road, and we lived in a house about a quarter mile up the road from here. We were the last house on this road with electricity. A dirt road and the last house on this road with electricity. And this was the rock that my brother and I spent countless hours as little kids climbing. And I'm astonished at my age to imagine how much that rock has shrunk in 70 years. It's so much smaller than it used to be, but we spent so much time trying to conquer that peak from multiple directions. Professor Robert Thorson at the University of Connecticut has written in Stone by Stone, rural farmstead walls have become cultural icons to the origin of America as a nation, as well as a reminder of the slower, simpler life before the modern era. Henry David Thoreau, we are never prepared to believe that our ancestors lifted large stones or built thick walls. How can their work be so visible and permanent and themselves so transient? When I see, Thoreau wrote, when I see a stone which must have taken many yoke of oxen to move, lying in a bank wall, I am curiously surprised because it suggests an energy and force of which we have no memorials. As we look at this picture of the Little Hoosic Valley taken in about 1890, we see a stone wall in the foreground with a little child sitting on top of the upper rail on the right side, peering out over a field. And we'll learn here that 1890, a lot of things were changing in Rensselaer County. What is that kid thinking about as he peers from the top rail of that fence across the landscape? Francis Colburn has painted several commemorative paintings in tribute of hill farmers. His inscription for this is, "The Vermont hill farmers lived a hard scrabble life, struggling against poor agricultural conditions, including rocky, nutrient-poor soil and often harsh weather." He paints them as having great dignity and compassion. In 1790, Samuel Dean, the reference is at the bottom here, the New England farmer, he wrote, he tells us something that is very important about farmers as early as 1790, not long after the Revolutionary War. It is much to be regretted that the most complicated of all the arts, of course, farming, of which the brightest genius may find sufficient room to exert and display itself, should be slighted and neglected by a people not generally wanting in ambition. And it is equally strange and unaccountable that the most useful and necessary of all employments, again, farming, should have been considered even by the enlightened people of New England as below the attention of any persons, excepting those who are in the lowest walks of life. Or that persons of a liberal or polite education should think it intolerably degrading to them to attend to practical agriculture for their support. How remarkable that in 1790, this was a perspective shared by some. And yet these are the folks who built these fantastic walls, of which, as you will see, there's a large number of miles of stone walls in New York and New England. It will be astonishing when I show you that number. The rocky soils, the second topic here, the rocky soils of New York and New England. Of course, we're probably all familiar that it has something to do with the glaciers. The glaciers in the upstate New York area, Rensselaer Plateau, ice thicknesses commonly estimated at about a mile or more thick during the peak of the ice age, the last ice age. And they transported rock from the north as the ice flowed. What this graph shows here, the top graph going from, on the right, present day, going back all the way to the left to about 400,000 years in the past. We're seeing here at the top graph how the carbon dioxide abundance in the atmosphere has changed rhythmically over time. Notice it was peaking during warm times at about 300 parts per million, and at the cold times at about 180 parts per million. And I've shown here 4 glaciations, and the red arrow is pointing at the end of the last ice age that ended about 20,000 years ago. But the last ice age was not the only ice age. There have been over 10 ice ages in the last 2 million years. And that is reflected in these are measured abundances of carbon dioxide in air going back 400,000 years. And at the bottom graph here, same time scale going from present day on the lower right here to 400,000 years in the past. Again, you can see that the average temperature has gone from very low temperatures in the lower right here to warm times, back to glaciation, to warm times, back to glaciation, and so forth. So those same glaciations, those 4 episodes of glaciation over the last 400,000 years are shown here to correlate with temperature, as you'd expect, but also with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And that the glaciers, of course, moved some pretty good boulders. And that's not me. Someone perched underneath this boulder that has been brought in by a glacier. This one is from New Salem, New York. But not only did it move large quantities of small things, but it also moved a small, relatively small number of very large things. And the white arrow on the lower right side there, that white arrow points at a person for scale. You can see that the glaciers could move some pretty impressive boulders. And the early farmers had to deal with all of these stones. Clearing the land of trees and rocks, our next topic. Rensselaer County, of course, shown here on this map of portions of Western New England and New York. Rensselaer County, of course, being about 48 miles, approximately 48 miles across, with the Hudson River bisecting it. This map from 1767, which is available in the New York State Archives and elsewhere, points out some of the residences, the homes, the people, the farmers who resided in Rensselaer Manor at the time of 1767. And these boundaries I show here in red, many of those persist today as stone walls. Those boundaries were laid out in the early 1700s. Farmers put stone walls along those boundaries, and those stone walls persist. Of course, this was a heavily forested area, and families teamed up oftentimes in the early days with oxen to clear the land. When it was cleared of trees, of course, then you had stumps, and the farmers, before they removed the stumps, would farm often between the stumps, as you see this farmer on the right side hoeing the soil with the stumps yet to be removed. Farmers often got money by going around to their neighbors and pulling stumps. And there were a whole bunch of different ways that they invented for pulling stumps. And here is one photograph from the late 1800s showing a team of farmers who have used horses and pulleys, shown here at the top of this apparatus here, which have lifted this stump out of the ground. There were other contraptions, innovative folks who would remove these stumps, winches, such as on the top photograph, winches, of course, horse-drawn winches that would remove stumps from the ground. And also these remarkable pieces of engineering shown here in the lower photograph, pulled by oxen, and these arches, these massive wooden arches, which would lift stumps out of the ground. If you look carefully on the right side of the lower photograph, you can see a stump suspended from that apparatus. The walls, fences, and wires, farmers oftentimes started by having a stump wall in which the stumps that had been removed from their fields would then serve as temporary fences, and livestock those would serve as formidable barriers to most livestock, and stump walls were commonly the first step of fencing a pasture. Zigzag fences, or down here in Virginia, these are called Virginia fences. Zigzag fences were often used, and these had a disadvantage and an advantage. The advantage was that they were not dug into the ground. If you wanted to move them, you could pick up these different pieces and you could move them into another location. The bad news is you can see that they are very expensive with respect to wood. You need an awful lot of wood to make these things. Now, as long as there's a lot of forest, then you have a lot of wood. But eventually, zigzag fences would just not possible because the forests were being cut. Eventually, of course, the farmers, in order to plow fields, needed to remove all of these glacially derived stones, and farmers would commonly use stone sleds, heavy, usually oak, wooden sleds. They would winch these using crowbars, winch them onto the stone sleds and have oxen remove them to another location, to a cairn or a stone pile, or over to the wall if that's where they wanted to put them. Perhaps as you've wandered through the woods, you've not only seen stone walls, but you've also seen stone piles like this. And what are these? Well, there's a lot of discussion about what they are. For example, are they products of 18th and 19th century farmers, or could any of them be from Mohican ancestors? Could our ancestors, Native American ancestors, have made stone structures? There's quite a bit of research going on to try to determine whether and how many of these may have been built by Native Americans. Timothy Ives in 2013 wrote in Northeast Anthropology, piling stones is a step between field clearing and wall construction is addressed by agricultural reformist Samuel Dean, who we quoted earlier in his 1790 publication, mentions something I think pretty interesting. Dean's description says his description of typical winter work on a New England farm specifies that stones which have been piled may in the easiest manner be removed on sleds to the places where they are wanted. So you pull them out of the ground in the spring when the soil is soft, but then you move them with stone sleds in the winter when the ground is hard and it's covered by snow. So this implicates, he writes, this implicates field stone pulling and piling as a spring activity and relocation to walls as a winter activity. So as you look at stone walls, for example, we can imagine that maybe many of them were built during the winter when crops were not grown and the stones could be more easily moved across frozen, snow-covered ground. Here's a stone wall in Grafton Lakes State Park. One of these that I've measured, and you'll see this one later. In the 1800s, Fences were very important as status symbols. And the top quotation from the cultivator in 1842 points out that having good walls was important for keeping good relations with your neighbors. Eructations means belching. Take another look at your enclosures, Farmer's Monthly Visitor in 1845 mentions. Take another look at your enclosures and see that your fences are sound, firm, high, and close. If you do not, and should unhappily wake up some morning and find your cattle in the corn and your pigs in the peas, you will please to recollect that we told you so. Susan Allport's 1990 book, Sermons in Stone, The Stone Walls of New England and New York, I think is a treasure. Land which is not worth fencing is not worth having. Another perspective on what farmers thought about the importance of fences and stone walls. For every stone which you pick up and move, you shall have a credit. For every valuable tree which you cut down, you will have a debt. Again, the importance of preserving the forest. And finally, if a poor farmer happens to have a good fence, it is good luck. But it is considered an indispensable item for a good farmer to have a good fence. Just as we today in modern times tend to look at people's lawns and think something about people's lawns, at this time, farmers looked at fences and determined something about the owners. Here's the number that I mentioned to you a moment ago. In 1871, and again, the reference is given at the bottom, statistics of fences in the United States. In 1871, in New York and New England, and this publication itemizes the length of stone walls in New York and New England states. 310,000 miles of stone walls in New York and New England in 1871. And this graph is I'm showing you here on the x-axis, the horizontal axis is the square miles, area in thousands of square miles of the states. New York, for example, shown here at the top right, has an area of about 55,000 square miles. And notice that New York has about 95,000 miles of stone walls. These farmers were busy. 95,000 miles. The red lines are showing you the length of stone walls on average per square mile. So New York has about roughly 1.5 miles of stone walls per square mile of New York. On the other hand, if you look at the New England states, New Hampshire, for example, labeled here as NH, New Hampshire has 5 miles of stone walls for every square mile. Anyway, 300,000 miles of stone walls in New York and New England in 1871. Note that in perspective, the distance between here and the moon is 240,000 miles. So these farmers, again, were very busy. They generated a length of stone walls 70,000 miles greater than the distance between here and the moon. I think that's something to, I take my hat off and nod out of respect to these folks. In 1873, there was an invention made and exhibited, and here is the exhibit. Here is an exhibit by Henry M. Rose. This is a duplicate of an exhibit shown in a county, the DeKalb County Fair. In the Midwest, as people were moving to the Midwest, there were in many areas not stone walls. No longer there was not a great cache of stone to be used to make stone walls, and neither oftentimes were there a large number of trees in some areas. So farmers had to look for some other source of being able to fence their pastures. And this Henry Rose exhibited this idea in 1873 for barbed wire. He would have posts, wooden posts in the ground, and have barb-less wire strung between these posts, and hanging on one of them struts would be spikes driven into a piece of wood that would be serve as a deterrent for animals to approach the fence. This was his idea of barbed wire. Well, there are two characters who lived in DeKalb County who visited this exhibit, and Glidden, Joseph Glidden, and Jacob Haish, both, the light went on when each of these guys saw this and said, my gosh, I think it can be done better. And they both invented barbed wire. And the kind of barbed wire that they invented is shown here. Glidden, you can see the two strands of wire with the barb tied to one of those strands. That was patented in 1874. And Jacob Haish had two woven strands of wire in which the barbs were on both of the strands. And he called it the S-barb. These two guys fought out the patent, and it ultimately went to the US Supreme Court as to who owned a patent for barbed wire. It went to the Supreme Court. There must have been a lot of money in barbed wire. And yes, there was. There certainly was a lot. And you can guess here from the title at the top of the slide, Joseph Glidden named this design of barbed wire the winner because the US Supreme Court sided with him that he owned the patent for barbed wire. As I have walked the woods in Rensselaer County, I have come across, as you probably have as well, barbed wire along many of these stone walls. And here is one of my favorites. It was an unusual looking piece of barbed wire, two strands, but these are not barbed. There's nothing woven on them. There are literally blades that are sandwiched between these two strands. And it is the Crandall zigzag, and here are three of over 500 patented varieties of barbed wire. There are over 500 patented varieties of barbed wire, and here are three of them. And these are the common types that you will see, I think, in Rensselaer County, but there will be others that you will find too. So stay tuned, be aware, be alert to the different kinds of stone walls and the associated barbed wire. Finally, before we get to the midpoint, here is an important graph showing pastures or improved land cleared of forest, acres of land cleared of forest for these New England states. So I'll focus on the green one here. The green symbols are Vermont. And notice that this is in millions of acres, and the x-axis is calendar year. And notice that the green is going up. There's more clearing, more cleared land, and then in 1880, the reverse starts falling. Notice the quantity of cleared land starts dropping in 1880. And the same is true of Maine. And the same is true of New Hampshire. And the same is true of Massachusetts. 1880. Same graph, but an exploded scale because New York is such a much larger state than the other New England states. The New England states have those same curves that you're seeing at the bottom, but New York is such a much larger state. That's the curve that you see at the top here. Again, the same point. Notice more land being cleared, and then in 1880, less land cleared, less land. So in 1880, something happens in all of these states. Land starts going back to forest. Pastures start being abandoned. Why? As written about in the history of Connecticut agriculture, Jenkins in 1926 points out that it's competition from the Midwestern states. Previously, the agriculture in the New England and New York had been livestock industry, which used a lot of hay and pasture, needed a lot of clear land. These crops requiring a broad acreage, but when the seemingly exhaustless fertile lands of the West were opened, wool, mutton, and beef easily produced and easily carried or driven to shipping points was brought to market at prices with which Connecticut farmers with small fields and brush pastures could not compete. These lines of farming had to be given up. Their abandonment, the abandonment of those fields because these farmers no longer could compete with the Midwestern farmers because of the railroads, among other things, bringing all that produce to the east. Their abandonment inevitably caused a decrease of more than 1/2 of the improved farm acreage. And we saw that beginning around 1880. And finally, the use of motor vehicles for local transportation instead of horses accounts for a further reduction in hay acreage. Just to move along, the Western farms outcompeted the Eastern farmers, and they needed to come up with a better way of making a living. Finally, this quest for greater and easier profits bothered New England agriculturalists. Beginning in the 1840s, editorials in regional farm periodicals began decrying this speculative age. In an 1843 editorial on immigration, the Maine farmer noted, this will sound familiar to all of us, the Maine farmer noted that one of the hardest and latest lessons of life is contentment. To be contented with the acquisition of a competent and comfortable subsistence by steady and honest industry. I'll move on then to the intermission here and ask if you have any questions that we could pose on part 1 before we get to part 2.
Yes, John, we have some in the chat, so I will read them to you. So do many of these stone walls represent legal land boundaries of ownership, or were they more a function of agriculture or livestock control?
Yes, great question. On my next slides, will answer that. The answer is yes.
Okay.
Yes, and I was confused, and I will freely admit that. You will see the pattern of stone walls in the area that I mapped, and I had the same question. Which ones are boundaries and which ones are pasture, edges of pastures? And we'll crack the code.
All right, part 2 coming right up. Tom asks, were there crews for hire that would move stones, or who was it, just the families themselves, or do you know how that was organized? Yes,
it was commonly with the families, but neighbors would help each other. And also there were people who traveled around to earn a little bit of cash and did the manual labor as well. Yes, it was all of those things.
Great. There are some fun comments. I'm going to leave those to the end and just do one more question, then we can move on. What do you recommend for conserving and recording stone walls?
Map them. I think that you need to identify them and also be able to make a cogent, persuasive argument to landowners and to zoning boards in your community that these are remnants of a culture that needs to be preserved. I think they have a story that is worth preserving.
Thank you. We'll leave the other excellent comments to the end because I know you have a lot more to talk about.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much, Tanya. Here we go. Buckle up. So now we'll get to wandering the woods to measure stone walls. The two areas that I will specifically look at are the Red Star in Brunswick, where our home was before we retired, and a property in Grafton Lakes State Park. We'll discuss both of them. Here is a typical stone wall, an abandoned stone wall that was in my wanderings. It was so much fun. It was so much fun, as I suspect it is for all of you as well, to wander the woods and come upon stone walls and cellar holes and wonder who made them, who was here, what's the story? So here's the fruits of my labor. On weekends when I wasn't at work, I would wander the woods. And you can see the red vertical bar is a scale bar of nearly 1,300 feet, and nearly 900 feet on that horizontal red bar. So it gives you a scale of how much land I was covering with a handheld LiDAR, handheld GPS unit, in which, as I found a stone wall, I would record its latitude and longitude. And all of those points, all of the black points that you see there are stone walls. And I didn't plot anything. I did not plot anything until I thought, I think I've got the data. Let me see what it says. When I looked at that, I thought, what a mess. I don't know if any of these are boundaries, as the question raised. Are any of these boundaries? I don't see the pattern here. I was confused. I knew the data were excellent. The data are excellent. Wherever you see a point, there's a stone wall there. So, as a scientist, confusion precedes wisdom. Confusion precedes wisdom. As a scientist, I am continuously confused and constantly keep moving because I hate confusion. So I keep working hard to try to break through to some level of understanding. So I just kept going. Not mapping any more stone walls in that area. I had them all mapped. So I would go to the Brunswick Historical Society when I wasn't out in the woods on the weekends. And one day on the wall in the Brunswick Historical Society, I saw this. And you say, what the heck is this? Well, this is a 1790 map. And I could identify where our home was, and that's where the yellow dot is near the middle of this screen. And you can see Route 7, all of us know Route 7, going through between Brunswick, and Troy, and Brunswick, and over to Bennington. Well, this is where we were. We were off Route 7, and this is Smith Hill Road. And these are the boundaries. These are the boundaries. These are the 1790 boundaries of the land, and these boundaries have names. Wow. Families. That's the area, that's the yellow box shows the approximate area that I mapped, And now here comes the answer to that question. Are any of the stone walls that I found boundaries? Ding! Those red lines are where stone walls that I map right on top of boundaries on this 1790 map. And you can imagine the smile when I went into the holy mackerel, there it is. My gosh, it begins to make sense. I begin to know which walls are boundaries and which ones are interior pastures. Wow. And I've got names. I've got boundaries with names, and I know who built these walls, and it's just wow, wow, wow. So this particular wall here, nothing magic about this particular wall, but I showed it on the previous slide. This was now, I'll go back. It's this wall right here. It's a portion of that wall right there in the left corner is this wall here between Kunrad Ham and Andreas Hahnemann. It's boundary. That was a boundary line between those two families in 1790. LiDAR imaging. So it had taken me tens of hours, enjoyable hours wandering the woods and finding and mapping stone walls and coming up with that bewildering maze of dots, and then finding that some of them were boundaries from 1790. Well, but then I also learned about LiDAR and got the program, this computer program that I could process LiDAR images. LiDAR involves an aircraft flying along at some altitude where its latitude and longitude and altitude are being continuously monitored, and the technology is amazing. But coming out of the bottom of that aircraft are laser pulses, 200,000 laser pulses per second, in which each laser pulse goes down to the ground and comes back, and that pulse, among 200,000 others, the distance between the aircraft and where that pulse landed and returned to the aircraft is measured. 200,000 measurements per second are being made. It's amazing. What it gives you is this, and here's just an illustration of what LiDAR can do. Here is an image, just a standard aerial image from a small town in New Hampshire from one of my publications. And you can see a dirt road branching here. North is up, and you can see some newer homes. What does LiDAR show? So you can see a lot of trees. Everything is forested. Here's the LiDAR image of the same area. See, the road shows up very nicely, but notice these lines. If you look carefully, you can see all sorts of lines. And these straight lines that I've labeled here in yellow are the original lot boundaries that were surveyed in 1768 in this town. And the farmers that got those lots said, I know where the lot boundary is, and I'm going to put a wall along the lot boundary. And they put walls along these lot boundaries. And then we see that there are other stone walls that were built. And if you look at that carefully, you can see a whole bunch of stone walls. Within the forest, you'd never see them from the air, but LiDAR sees them. And you can also see abandoned cellar holes. I hope that you can see my arrow circling here in the lower right. There's an abandoned cellar hole, which again is in the trees. You couldn't see it, but there's another abandoned cellar hole. and other abandoned cellar holes up here, and another abandoned cellar hole over here. I mean, there's just a wealth of information here, and it's just boom, right in your face. You don't have to walk through the woods to find these things. They're right there. So with that in mind, here is the area I mapped. Took me hundreds, perhaps 100 hours to come up with that maze of dots mapping the stone walls. But here's a LiDAR image showing those stone walls. Now, the good news is I didn't miss any. I didn't miss any. The LiDAR says you got all of them. So that was nice. But boy, talk about making the effort easier. Those are some of the stone walls that I mapped. You can see they stand out like sore thumbs. And they also show cellar holes. And also here, the middle right edge that I'm circling on the arrow there is a 19th century quarry, 19th century quarry that farmers used for chimney stone. And a small pond here. Anyway, LiDAR is just something else. Grafton Lakes, real quickly here. Grafton Lake State Park, just as an illustration, here is just a visual image of Grafton Lakes State Park with Long Pond, of course, you're all familiar with that, and North Long Pond Road, a dirt road going along the east side of Long Pond. Beautiful site, but again, all forested. Here is a survey report of the land. And again, I remind you that these are available. These originals are available at the New York State Archives in Albany. I went to them and I said, I'd like to open up the following folder. And they said, sure. And they brought me out a stack, boxes of the original surveys. And I photographed them, and they are on CDs at the Brunswick Historical Society. So go to the archives if you want to actually handle them. Holy mackerel. Or if you can look at them this way, they're there for you to look at. But they give you the boundaries, directions and lengths, direction and lengths in chains, 3.16, 36.27. One chain is 66 feet. Distances were measured in chains by these surveyors. So anyway, here is Thomas West's survey done in 1793 in Grafton Lake State Park, and also in the CDs I brought to Brunswick Historical Society, but again also available at the New York State Archives are the maps of Grafton, Stephentown, all of the townships in Rensselaer County. The early maps are there. So I'm going to take a look at, here is Thomas West's property. Here is Long Pond, and this boundary here was 2,394 feet across. And I wonder if, holy mackerel, there it is. Here's Long Pond. This is Thomas West's property here. And here's the LiDAR image of Thomas West's area. And notice there are a lot of stone walls that show up. This red arrow here is the outline of Thomas West's property that you just saw on the survey map and in the survey itself. And the red arrow at the lower right there, you can see it's a very prominent stone wall, shows up like gangbusters in the LiDAR image, and that's the stone wall right there. There it is. So here is Here is Thomas West's property in LiDAR. And the next image is going to be zooming in a little bit closer on that one. Here we are a little bit closer in that. And I was curious as I looked at that LiDAR image before I started exploring this area on foot. I said, geez, that red arrow is pointing at something that is unusual. Just something unusual about that. You can see a lot of stone walls. And here is North Long Pond Road and Fire Tower Road here and Long Pond Road on the left. But that area looked different to me. A stone wall going up to it, another stone wall going away from it, but something different. That's what it is. It's 8 feet tall. 8 feet tall. Look at the size of those stones. And the entire thing is filled in the back. The entire back is filled in with stones as well. I believe, this is my hypothesis, so I have an inverted commas here in stone wall. I actually don't think it's really a stone wall. There's a stone wall on both sides of it, on both ends of it, but I don't think this was a stone wall. It's a stone structure. And I think that this is what it was. Here is a farm in Lexington, Greene County, New York. And I think that what we're seeing there is the remnant of a barn foundation, of a multi-story barn foundation. The barn is long gone, but this magnificent foundation, and also the one in Grafton is filled in just like this, just like that as well. So the Wests had this magnificent farm, barn, multi-story barn that was must have been a prize. Also found this, there was a subtle feature right here shown by the red arrow, and I wondered about that. Here were the house foundations, a cellar hole right there. And then I wondered about this, right there where that red arrow is. So here is that foundation we were just looking at right there. And this, it's the family cemetery. And notice that the walls have now fallen, but they are not made of large stones. The reason for that, I've been told, is because the cemeteries were walled by the whole family. All the kids, all the adults, all the old folks would bring to the wall whatever they could carry. And little kids couldn't carry big stones, so they would bring small stones. So these represent small stones and large stones that were brought by members of the entire family to rim this cemetery. And here is one of the cemetery stones right here. And I show portions of its text. Joseph A., son of Thomas West and Emily Potter, died July 16, 1844, aged 2 years, 1 month, and 19 days. The summary then of what we've gone through here is the following. Reading very, very quickly the whole range of enclosures for fields, going from stump fences to wood fences to stone walls and to wire fences. Barbed wire comes in around 1875. In 1872, according to Dodge, there were 310,000 miles of stone walls in New York and New England in 1871. It's generally thought that farmers could, if there were 2 strong, healthy folks working, they could lay about 10 feet of wall per day if they had a team of oxen. Interestingly, with 310,000 miles, you'd think that the farmers might have mentioned this in their diaries. They don't. It's rare that the farmers mention walls in their memoirs. Something so permanent something so spectacular is not even mentioned in their memoirs. Abandonment of farms because of competition from Western farms, again, as we mentioned, about 1880. And in fact, at that time, farm machinery started getting big, trying to compete with the Western farms. Some of the Eastern farmers would bury their stone walls so that they could put big farming equipment into these small fields and turn them around without being encumbered by stone walls. Stone walls even became a source of stone for roadways. Finally, then, a day hike through the woods can provide a rewarding experience. For many of us, a solitary walk into the woods provides a rare opportunity for recreation, contemplation, meditation, and even spirituality. I would argue the following: that old stone walls are deserving of preservation. They have stories to tell, and tonight we have only touched the surface of the stories they can tell. I have compiled stories about families that lived on the road that we lived on in Brunswick. It is astonishing. I know these people. I know them. I have visited their graves. I know these people. I am so pleased to have gotten to know them through their stone walls, through their deeds, through their survey reports, through all of the other documents that if you really work hard to find the documentation, you can find their stories. And finally, if you're interested in learning more, the following slides have some of the articles and books for you to consider. And I'm just going to quickly, in the 1 minute I've got here, show you that there's a pretty good list of things here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John. What an honor you've done to all of the people who toiled over these rock walls and their histories. Normally, we're very strict about our ending time. It's 8:04. If you're willing to take a couple more questions, there are two rather compelling questions in the chat. So one is, there's three. Are the LiDAR images available for public use? And how would we all access LiDAR imaging?
Yes, a good question. I'm sorry I went over time. I can be here until midnight if you want. The LiDAR images, when I was doing this work originally, I had to get the program to download the data, which is publicly available. The data are publicly available at the site shown here at the very bottom. See the orthos.dhses.newyork.gov. The data are available there for downloading. But when you open the files, if your computer can even open the files, it looks like garbage. Until you have the computer program that can process the images, and then you get these beautiful images. So first, for Brunswick Historical Society, I have processed images for folks. They let me know where they live and what area they want to be surveyed with LiDAR. I can send them the processed images. And I've done that. Otherwise, I would suggest before you do that, and I can do that, is go to this site here, this website that I'm showing at the bottom here, and peruse it, because there are some LiDAR images ready to go right on that site.
That's great information. Thank you. So next question, is there any evidence of rock shaping or carving to match surfaces between adjacent stones in the walls?
In the walls that I have looked at, no.
Okay, thanks.
I may have overlooked things. You know, I've mapped many miles of stone wall. I may have overlooked something, but I don't recall having seen any shaped.
Okay, thanks. And lastly, what GPS or mapping software do you recommend?
The GPS that I used was simply a handheld Garmin instrument, a GPS instrument that you hold in your hand and it connects to GPS satellites. And then as I was being eaten alive by mosquitoes, I would just record, on Notepad, the latitude and longitude and some details about the stone walls and what kind of wire it had and what direction it was going in and so forth. And then I'd move on to the next location. But that's all I did. And I suspect smarter people with better technology and can do better than I did. But that's what I did. And then I plotted it in an Excel spreadsheet, which is what you saw.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks so much. This has been amazing. There were other fun comments for everybody. Someone suggested the stone wall building moon, similar to the harvest moon, so that walls could be built by the light of the moon. And someone commented that some of this is very familiar to him, having grown up in Stephentown, and used some of these subsistence farming methods. So I want to thank you, John. This has been amazing. And thank you all who joined this evening. Remember, this is recorded. So if you want to go back and take another look, it will be up on the RPA website within a week or so. And thanks again, John.
Thank you, Tanya. And please note, for anyone who's interested, my email address is listed at the bottom of this slide here. Please contact me if I can be of any help. And again, it was a privilege being invited to speak at the RPA Speakers Series. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good night, everyone. See you next time. Bye-bye.